Welcome to American Building. I'm your host, Atif Kader. Join me as we explore the skylines and strip malls, the crosswalks and rail crossings, the balconies, the buildings, and the boroughs shaping the next generation of real estate. Let's build common ground. Today, our guest is architect Michael Chen, who's a principal at MKCA. Michael started down his path of being an architect at the University of California at Berkeley. After graduating from the undergraduate program, he worked as a designer in the Bay Area and then went to Columbia for the Masters of Architecture program. He then joined Polshek Partnership in New York and taught and then practiced design under the name Normal Projects. He launched MKCA in 2011 and also launched a nonprofit organization, Design Advocates, in 2020. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Curbed, and Architectural Digest. MKCA is a New York-based architecture and design firm working at an array of skills and sectors from interior design to civic projects. We'll be talking about the Pieta Mare project, which is the renovation of a 600 square foot apartment on a large yacht. More broadly, we will learn about the methods and materials needed to build at sea. So thank you so much for being here with us, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start from the start. Tell me about how you knew that you wanted to pursue architecture.
Being an architect is one of those professions that I think a child can understand and decide to engage in. For me, it was a choice between zookeeper and architect when I was about 6. I'm horribly allergic to every creature, and so I think architecture was just the path that I chose for myself. It was kind of the way that I imagined everything when I was a kid growing up. Drawing houses. I That was just my favorite activity, and when
Uh-huh.
I decided to apply for school, it just seemed like the thing to do.
So my kindergarten drawing was one side was race car driver and the other was judge when I was prompted with what I wanted to be. And I think that probably is very telling about my personality, even now. But you mentioned zookeeper, and I know that you were a prolific drawer at a young age. Did those two ever overlap in terms of what were you drawing?
I you know I was drawing a lot of houses and buildings and cities, but you're right, there were some crossover moments. There was one drawing in particular. I think maybe I was 8 or 9. I wallpapered my bedroom in kind of computer paper from my mother's office, and I spent about 3 months drawing this really meticulous raccoon civilization. The raccoons had cities and outfits, and they had a space agency, like, kind of a really elaborate world making exercise. But they have hands and
Hmm. And
stylish
opposable thumbs.
striped tails. Yeah, 100%. So that was the first clients, if you will.
Clients, as an architect certainly are wild, and I'm guessing, raccoons were no different. You continued on, and you, landed at Berkeley, you studied there, and your first job in San Francisco was with Allied Architecture and Design, and then later on, your first job in New York was with Polshek Partnership. So tell me what you learned at both of those places.
My very, very first job was working with someone who had been a professor of mine as an
Mhm.
as an undergraduate. And I think I mean, first of all, just that idea of having one foot in the academy and one foot in the world of practice was something that was incredibly alluring to me, even as a very young designer. And so I really wanted to learn what that was about. Uh, the practice was very much concentrated on commercial spaces and in particular restaurants
Mhm.
in San Francisco, sort of in that era just before the first dot com boom. And what I learned in that environment was how to design very, very quickly, but also how to sort of thread these really complex systems into existing buildings. And so
Hmm.
in San Francisco, there were seismic concerns, and there was also kind of all the guts and then also the visual environment of a restaurant. And so just really, I think learning what all of the parts of building are and how they can mean different things to different people, like that was an incredible experience as a young designer. I think in the 2 years that I was there, I think I worked on 13 projects, kind of super fast, uh, some more extensive, some some less so, but just kind of cutting your teeth as a young designer was really, in that way, it was really incredible. Um, at Polshoek, what I learned was how to build at kind of a dramatic and institutional scale, and in a way, the polar opposite kind of project. Very, very long, very complex client structures, very, very intricate programs, but also kind of incredibly, also very much public facing um, institutional projects, educational buildings, museum buildings. Um, and just to understand, again, sort of the complexity of what goes into a building like that and how it works within the city. And also kind of drawing on that experience of as being a younger architect, working on similar things at a smaller scale. I think that was also just an incredible learning experience. I was very fortunate at Polshoek because the main project that I worked on during my time there was it was a very, very small team. It was a museum project in Washington, DC, in its very, very early stages.
Hmm.
Um, and it was a team that was led by Jim Polshoek himself and a relatively small kind of group of designers. And I was one of those recent graduates, who was really facile digitally, and so was tasked with kind of an extraordinary responsibility of helping the team to kind of integrate all of that information into into models and into rendered images that are kind of the way that we work now. But in 2003, when I was doing that work, it was still not fully integrated into the way that architects kind of think about building and how they communicate about building. And so that was something that was very new, even to a firm like that.
Hmm.
And so just you know the incredible agency of being young and kind of and able with new tools was itself kind of an extraordinary learning experience.
So when you talked about that, the learning process in terms of doing lots of projects with the first firm that you worked at in San Francisco, and then integrating technology and taking on a lot of responsibility at a relatively young age with Bolshak, I think both seem to be incorporating this idea of continual learning. And then you spent some time teaching at Pratt in Brooklyn, where you're currently still also part of the faculty. Is that correct?
I actually stepped down in 2019, but
Oh, okay.
until very recently. Yeah.
Until very recently. So then at Pratt in Brooklyn, I also previously had teaching experiences at Berkeley and Cornell. So tell me about the process of teaching and doing your own projects along the way and the breaks that really got you going to move towards starting your own firm.
I think that the extraordinary privilege to work with students and to work in community with just an incredible group of designers, architects who are also sort of moving in and out of academia was just an enormously enriching experience. There are a number of things that were kind of key takeaways from my academic experience. One of them was really just learning what it is to make a project. I I I was I was given a responsibility to run a thesis seminar and studio. So I was working with students for a year from the very beginning of my teaching career, um, working with the same group of students for over the course of an entire year to develop a research agenda to articulate how that might translate into a design project, and then to implement that project. And that arc of thinking about problem definition and then kind of finding ways for design thinking to have impact and also agency, and kind of disciplinary significance, like in the context of a thesis project, like that kind of thinking it is extraordinary. And I think the experience of this is why so many architects, I think, love their thesis year, or kind of think about how much they learned in their thesis year. I had 12 of them in that time. And so just the sharpening one's ability to kind of scan the landscape of the world, identify problems that maybe don't seem to be problems of architecture, but are maybe adjacent to or relevant to architecture in some way, and then trying to construct pathways to explore those issues in real projects. Like that exercise, I think, is something that I draw upon that experience daily, now as a practitioner. The other thing that was really extraordinary about teaching is that it's so much about producing a community around you. And so as I transitioned from, you know, basically in effect full-time academic to full-time practitioner, maybe the first 6 or 8 people who ever worked with me in my firm were people that I knew from before, either through teaching or through kind of other relationships. And I think that to be able to build a practice with people that you already know, that you already trust, that you already kind of share common culture with, it was so valuable. And so many of those people are still with me, a decade hence. And so like that was an incredible kind of benefit of teaching, that in a way I hadn't really expected, even though my early professional experience was exactly that. It was sort of like a trusted and dear professor, a kind of incredible professor teacher and student relationship that became a professional relationship. It hadn't really occurred to me that that would be the way that one could begin a practice. And when it happened, it was extraordinary.
So you mentioned being able to get the benefits of a dozen theses at the same time when you're in the role of being a teacher as opposed to being the person producing the thesis. What are some of those um, that really stood out for you that you recall very, very clearly even now?
Um, well, the thesis studio that I ran was kind of concentrated around ideas of the near future city.
Hmm.
And so we spent a lot of time thinking about things like sustainable infrastructure, climate change, logistics, the supply chain, you know, drone delivery. But there was an incredible drone delivery project that we had in the studio. No students graduated, I want to say, in 2017. So,
Hmm.
it was kind of like when it was a pipe dream, we sort of said like, okay, well, this was an interesting thing to think about. What might its impact be on the city? And you can see these little kernels of our present reality kind of manifesting now around things like that. We did a number of projects around that were kind of location specific.
Hmm.
Um, we did a studio that was all about the future of the Bronx, um, and just identifying like where the places in the Bronx that we think are sort of subject to gentrification pressure or infrastructure pressure, or might be downstream of sort of the most negative impacts of climate change, and then trying to think about what that might mean for the development of housing or the food supply in New York City, which all comes to the Bronx. And so
Mhm.
those kinds of projects, I think, you know, I think about them, but all the time. I mean, they were really incredible things to kind of participate in. There was also an aspect of those thesis projects that is kind of a dimension of storytelling,
Mm.
and really trying to think about how architects draw, how architects speak, what they put at stake in the design work, that is aligned or that reinforces, these ideas that are being developed in a studio. And so, just thinking about different kinds of drawing. We used a lot of sort of models from almost from kind of like Asian art. Like they were, a lot of times we were talking about scenario planning, or we were talking about kind of making big drawings that were almost kind of narrative landscape drawings, where activities are sort of unfolding, kind of like the Raccoon City activities unfolding kind of over a great big drawing. Like those are um, those are devices that we still use in our office today.
I think uh, that aspect of the narrative as part of the design process is really important because the physical product that you build is the stage for the stories that people tell when they live there, they work there, and they occupy those spaces. So that's a great anecdote to share. So MKCA stands for Michael K. Chen Architectures. This is your firm. So tell me about what you're focusing on there right now.
So we do a mix of different types of projects, and many different locales.
Hmm.
Much of our work is residential, but because we work with so many clients who are either um, sort of actors in the cultural sphere or sort of behind the scenes in the cultural sphere, we work with a lot of writers and architects and artists. Um, uh, Other designers, and then people kind of in industries that are adjacent um, to those kinds of cultural activities. I think we tend to have a lot of crossover. So we think about art spaces, we think about kind of food spaces, but I think that at the heart of what we are doing is to create environments for people. Exactly as you say, they're kind of settings for contemporary life
Hmm.
to unfold. Many of our work has historically been in sort of the historic precincts of New York City. That's a little bit the way that we came up. But now increasingly we're making new buildings in places like upstate New York. We have projects also all over the world. We've designed houses in Hawaii. We have projects in Paris, working on a villa in the south of France, um, as well as kind of smaller community oriented projects, libraries, community centers, that sort of health centers, that sort of thing.
So one of the areas in terms of geography that you didn't mention in that list is out at sea. So let's focus on the Pieta Mare project. So it's an apartment that you renovated at sea, and it's the renovation of a 600 square foot condominium, and that's aboard a ship that's at sea for 3 years at a go. So you have to tell us what this is all about, what this boat's deal is, what the vibes in the space were like. So just tell us everything.
Um, so I've been sworn to secrecy about certain aspects of this of this vessel. You can Google it; it's findable. But that is a little bit the premise. It is in maybe the easiest way to talk about it is that it's a it's kind of a floating condominium building. And so it is a fairly small, as cruise ships go, like ship mm, with, let's say, like 6 levels of apartments. I want to say that there are about 200 apartments
Mhm.
aboard the ship, all owner occupied. And I think the premise is really that it is a that it's a vessel because because it is at sea 365 days a year, and kind of the schedule is published 3 years in advance. It's a way for owners to organize their holiday time, based on the itinerary of the ship. They sort of fly to where the ship is, they get on board, they exit where the ship is when it's time to go. And it's not something that I knew about. The clients for that particular project had seen some very early work that we had done in the office. Some of the very first projects that I worked on were kind of small New York City apartments, mostly for friends,
Mhm.
often with some degree of transformation or motion, that were kind of highly multifunctional. And I think that that aspect, those clients saw that and felt like that was something that might really work well um, on aboard their new apartment. So we started working together. They weren't people that we knew from before, but we've now subsequently done a number of projects with them. They came to us with sort of this extraordinary thing, like, "Hi, we have sort of an oddball request. We have this apartment aboard a ship. We like this multifunctional work that you've been doing. Um, would you consider?" And that set into motion like a 2-year adventure, where we had to learn very quickly what to make, how to make it, and how to translate some of the things that we were doing, which were really kind of scrappy, you know, almost DIY kinds of moving elements, to how to translate that into something that could be installed aboard a moving vessel, that was going to be tossed in the sea and subject to all the different kinds of performance requirements and safety requirements and fire requirements that one finds on on like a yeah like on a ship.
So let's dive into that. Just as an aside, the Instagram for MV the World, the name of the boat, is pretty epic. So I encourage listeners to check it out. What were you touched on it right at the end there? What were the problems and the opportunities that you saw with this particular design brief?
I mean, the main problem with designing on a ship that is constantly at sea is getting access to the ship. Um, so the way that this works on the world, uh, is that the ship goes into kind of a relatively generous dry dock period for major projects, once every 3 years.
Mhm.
That period is only about a month, which is really not enough time to gut renovate a space, especially one that needs to be made to the standards of the ship. Like everything has to be welded, for example. Um, so we were working with a partner, which is called List. It's a family-run shipbuilding company, based in Vienna, uh, to design and fabricate the the majority of the elements that we implemented in the apartment. Um, so that was really one of our first real um, real encounters with prefabrication, uh, kind of at a very, very, very detailed scale.
Mhm.
Um, so we were working on, inside of List's factory and outside of Vienna, to design and develop, these elements that could be implemented relatively quickly in this fairly brief dry dock period, and that could also be serviced in the subsequent periods when workers were permitted to kind of board the ship as if they were owners, kind of while it's at sea. So those are sort of the two different contact points that are designated by the ship for construction. So we needed to kind of fit a pretty substantial project into these very little windows and try to figure out how to design for that. There's another complexity, of course, which is that on a moving vessel, you need to design to standards that work for seafaring standards in terms of materials, but also every single thing has to be able to be sea safe. You need to be able to kind of batten down the hatches. And when
Literally.
you're designing an apartment, yeah, literally. But when you're also designing an apartment where literally every single thing moves, those two things are in a little bit of conflict with each other. So just having to design, this is a way that we kind of leaned into our past history. Where like there's always a flirtation here, kind of skirting around the edges of architecture and interior design and product design. Like we tend to design somewhat fluidly between those disciplines. And so really just thinking about finding the right partners to fabricate certain elements, and then thinking in really novel ways about how to secure every single last moving thing, but in a way that wasn't utilitarian, but was actually just really elegant. Like that was very challenging. So I'll give you an example. There's a dining table in the apartment, but it folds down from the wall. It's quite an elegant dining table. It's made of bronze and aluminum, and so it's massively heavy. And so we developed this piston system so that it would lower very gently and also be able to be lifted very gently with just one person. And at the same time, there was a leg that kind of swung down as the table comes down. There's a leg that swings down, and that leg was engineered to be a lever because when the table is up and the leg is down, it throws a stainless steel pin into the metal frame that is around the opening, and that is what kind of locks the table into place. And so it needed to both move in a really simple and sort of lovely way, but it also needed to have this very heavy duty mechanism that would kind of hold it into place if the sea is rough and the ship is getting kind of moved around. And so those are the kinds of things that we had to sort of sometimes design around or simply kind of engineer in order to make these things work.
Okay, so you're talking about the motion of the boat, the logistics of being able to do construction while at sea with relatively small windows of time. You are at sea, and there's large windows on this vessel. So talk to me about UV rays. Talk to me about it's a small space. It's 600 square feet for a two-bedroom. So limited space to do things. What were some of the other challenges that you found in looking at this particular project?
I mean, some of the spatial challenges of working in a small space are just that it's small. And so you're trying to find ways to um, both incorporate all of the elements that the clients are asking for, but also trying to do it in a way where maybe you don't give away the whole space all at once. And so the design of the interior is really bound up in that and kind of its intersection with kind of how we made it. So there is a bit of a pod like language. There are two volumes that are clad in aluminum ribs that were inserted into the middle of the rectangular space. And the way that you move around, the way that you access the various spaces of the apartment is to move around them. And that was very deliberate. Dimensionally, it was very deliberate because, we needed to find a way to kind of literally get these elements into the space. And spatially, it means that you can be kind of two people can be right next to one another, but their path of travel is somewhat distant. So you begin to feel as if the space is more expansive than it actually is. These are some little spatial sort of tricks, sleight of hand that we've learned over the years, just working in New York City and thinking about how to plan space intelligently. From a materials standpoint, you're right that the environment is fairly harsh, and this is just something that we kind of leaned into. So
Hmm.
some of the materials are very performance driven, and some of them are actually envisioned or meant to change over time, or they're meant to patina, they're meant to oxidize. It's part of their aesthetic proposition from the word go, and that was really about kind of embracing both the presence of live finishes, but also kind of thinking about the the presence of the environment and the in a way the fingerprint of the travel of
Hmm.
the of the vessel begins to be present in the space. We thought that that was a really beautiful and romantic idea that in many ways softened what was kind of a fairly hard set of materials that ultimately we had to use, um, and a fairly hard modernist language that the clients were interested in. So that presence of these materials that would just show where gradually over time and kind of change with subsequent visits. Like we loved this idea that somehow it's the apartment is kind of, I don't know, it's kind of growing and changing with with the owners.
So you touched on modernist design, and modernism in general had a fascination with industrial objects and even cruise ships. So talk to me more about the design inspiration that you drew from when you were developing the design strategy for the space.
I mean, the cruise ship lives large in the modernist imaginary. It's something that the early modernists were very, very interested in, both because it was collapsing the world and in a really interesting way, but also I think because of the language of streamline and of industrial materials. So that's something that we were very, very interested in implementing, partly out of necessity, although
Hmm.
not purely that. The 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 design of that apartment is a little, it leans into machine, more than is strictly necessary from a performance standpoint. It's a That's an aesthetic decision about about kind of recognizing the significance of these kinds of vessels and in the language that we're drawing on for much of our architectural work. So we had many many conversations with the clients about that history.
Hmm.
That's not something that they necessarily knew about directly, but they were very interested in learning about. And we picked furnishings and other details that very deliberately reference that era, but are not necessarily from that era. So we had made a decision early on that the expression aesthetically, both from the architecture as well as the interior design, would be contemporary. It would That we would draw heavily from the work of contemporary makers and contemporary designers, but we
Hmm.
wanted to do that in a way that would recognize sort of those modernist origins. And so there are shapes that are familiar. There are, there's the presence of a metal frame. There are some vintage pieces, but they're not the recognizable vintage pieces. They're just pieces from that era, from the early '60s, or pieces that refer back to the '20s, as part of the language of the interior. And those are again this layering of the narrative, right? Like
Hmm.
the design is equal parts sort of the setting for the future, the life that is lived in the space, but it's also a product of these many layers of registration that are happening. That some of which we're grabbing from the past and trying to kind of move into the present. So that quality of patina and oxidation in the material is also present in the fact that we're using, you know, furnishings from different eras that feel collected and feel like they've been accumulated over time in this brand new environment.
I see. As opposed to, say, a time machine back to a certain design period. I think that's very thoughtful. So you've described the initial challenges and the solutions that you put together to address those challenges. Walk us through visually if listeners were staying in this space in this beautiful condo as they open the door. What are the things that they're seeing as they move through this space so they can visually imagine what you're saying?
So as you walk into the apartment, you are greeted with a very generous little foyer space. And in that space is a place to take your coat off or to kind of put your shoes away, often because the nature of travel on a vessel is that you have been on some adventure when you come back to the apartment, and you might have the evidence of that adventure on your body. So there's
Hmm.
a place to there's laundry, there's coats, there's shoes, there's a there's a moment of stone floor, and there's also kind of a couple of mechanisms that are there for because you can get room service on in in these apartments, and so there's a there's a little fold down table that where you can leave the tray of breakfast or what have you, for the staff to take away. Um, and then you're presented with sort of a long, relatively narrow passageway
Hmm.
that is directly facing the the glazed wall of the apartment, and that is to sort of attenuate your experience. To sort of, you can see the view, but you don't have full access to the width of the apartment. That's just a little trick of design, but it's also sort of the space between the two pods
Hmm.
that we've added that have bathrooms and the kitchen and sort of closet storage spaces loaded into them. So as you enter the as you kind of pass through that passageway, the space opens up until you get the full width of the glazed facade. And so that was the other thing, is we wanted to incorporate sort of a reach, the largest, most panoramic expression that you can get, or experience that you can get in the apartment, is then made available to you as you enter the living room. There are two bedrooms, if you will. There are Murphy beds that fold down at the end of each pod, and then there's a series of sliding screens that disappear into the pods that partition the spaces into two bedrooms when when you need. Those those folding beds are they were made by an Austrian company called Ladenstein, and um, the amazing thing about those beds is that they're engineered so that they don't have a foot at the end. They're cantilevered, and so the they're facing the glazing, so that you can kind of experience the view, but they have no structure underneath them. They're all supported from the pod um, beyond, uh, and they're kit out to feel like bedrooms. So
Hmm.
the niche that they're in is really generous. It's lined in mohair and lacquer, and it's really intended to impart a luxurious and sort of sumptuous experience. And that's because literally every other surface is metal. The walls are steel that are painted. The kind of the edges of the pods are lacquered aluminum bars, kind of laminated to a fiberglass substrate. The floor is wood, but there's 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 not a lot of softness
Hmm.
in the environment. So really, the sleeping spaces become these very cozy, sumptuous, quiet uh, spaces. Um, they have a lot of padding and a lot of dense fabric in them, and it does actually begin to dampen sort of the hum of the machine that you're aboard. And then in the living room space, that's just off to the side, it's very similar. The materials are are very, very tactile and rich. So marble, oxidized steel, mohair, things that, materials that will hold up to the environment, but that are natural and that will kind of show wear over time.
Okay, so this is an amazing project, and you've learned a ton about it. I want to bring this a bit bigger picture, and I want to ask you about the choice of the materials that you described and how they connect to other projects that you're working on, or the way that you think about designing overall.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that our approach to materials is never exclusively visual and it's never exclusively performance driven. It is about accessing that narrative quality that materials have, but also thinking about sort of the narratives that are embedded in them. So we approached many of these material choices through a historic lens in this particular project. Other times we might approach a material from more of a sustainability lens or a labor lens or an exploitation lens, or, just really thinking about how the elective choices that we make as designers are linked
Mhm.
to larger value systems that we hold and that the clients also subscribe to. I think that that's something that we're very, very interested in. And it doesn't have to necessarily be about pursuing a sustainability agenda, although that's something that we're
Mhm.
extremely interested in, but not necessarily thinking about that agenda by itself in isolation with other things and at the expense of other dimensions of the experience of a project. And so I think it really is about kind of activating that landscape of the world that we occupy and that we have influence in, even though I think architects sometimes aren't aware of, or they're not wielding that influence in a way that is very, very effective. And I think that our specifying power is kind of immense. Uh, so there are real ways to kind of produce, I think, bigger impacts through the
Mhm.
choices that we're making. And there are also ways to produce kind of concentrated, poignant experiences through the decisions that we're making. And sometimes those things are linked to each other, which I think is a really interesting thing. So in this particular project, for example, much of the sourcing of materials is a little bit defined by the performance criteria that
Yep.
we had to live we had to live with. But our choice of collaborators to produce certain elements, whether that's furnishings or whether that's built-in elements or whether that's lighting, that choice was really about straddling this kind of historic aesthetic, a kind of, updating a modernist language for the present day. And it was also about making sure that independent voices, that diverse voices operating in the world of design had a presence in the project because that was something that was important to us. So those things are not either or propositions. They were just kind of we were able to weave them together in a single project.
And then similarly, you talked about construction detailing that you used throughout the project, and tell me about some of the corollaries you may have on your design strategy overall in terms of detailing of projects you work on.
I mean, it's really important to us that products are made beautifully,
Hmm.
that they work well. Those are top level concerns for us. And I think that that really speaks to our commitment to craft in just at the highest possible level. And I think that's a commitment that many architects share. Our That idea for us is something that we think extends beyond the details and the material kind of that we're manipulating at any given time, and it really does extend to kind of a larger, more sort of social ways of being in the world realm. So we're really thinking about when we're talking about having to devise a process to be able to build the project on a moving vessel, and working in partnership with expert builders who are familiar with that adapting the design as accordingly, like that to me is also craft. When we're talking about selecting materials that have a kind of historic resonance, but that will also um, show traces of use and kind of the romance of being able to visit them as they change over time. Like this is a dimension of craft, just as the care of workers um, and stewardship of the climate are aspects of what we do, and these are dimensions of craft as well. So I think the details are in many ways about where the rubber meets the road. It's kind of like making a choice that might produce a linkage. We think about details almost as like portals between universes.
Uh-huh.
So the choice to allow for motion is a choice to is about choosing to overlay two uses that might not belong to in the same place on top of one another. Like that's usually what that detail is about. It's about a transaction between one state to another state, or the exchange of use from one use to another. And I think that those kinds of scripts, in a way, those narrative devices are about understanding the way that people are ultimately going to live and how they're going to transition from one activity to another. And that is what drives the detail. It's sort of like it's not necessarily about us being kind of gearheaded about wanting to wanting to make something move or trying to fashion some sort of gizmo that
Uh-huh.
is novel for the sake of novelty. It really is about understanding the ebb and flow of activity over the course of the day into the evening, and into the next day, and trying to find ways to facilitate those transitions in a manner that requires the least amount of effort, right? Or the simplest gesture. And so that kind of refinement is also something that is like about a material refinement, but it's also
Uh-huh.
about understanding the role that the architecture is playing in the life of the people who live in it.
So the words that you used in that description, beauty, simplicity, transformation, a lot of that uh, makes so much sense in terms of the values that you have for your firm, and also where your firm began with projects like the unfolding apartment and other micro projects, because that is exactly the way that you create a successful project at such a small scale, is focusing on those things. So I definitely appreciate your responses. So in terms of the small space that we're talking about today, the Pied à Mer, an additional question is, how did permitting and inspections work on a project that was moving around the world? Like, what was the jurisdiction that was even responsible for this?
Um, the first jurisdiction is the ship itself in this case, and there are international standards that are published and for fire safety, um, and there are also rules of thumb
Mhm.
that are acknowledged, like the sea saving aspect. There are tricky things. Uh, Fortunately, like the ship uses American power standards, and
Mhm.
so we could buy appliances that were the right thing, or lighting that was the right thing. Um, so you know that's all very learnable. It's it's maybe a little bit unique to this particular situation, but we are in construction on an apartment in Paris right now, and in Paris there are rules spoken and unspoken that you need to know about and need to respect. I think that is about doing the homework,
Mhm.
and it's also about working with the right partners, so that so that you have the benefit as an architect of working with people who really know the rules of the road where you're working. And that's something that we always try to make room for in our process. We want to be excellent collaborators. We want to work with people who are excellent collaborators.
Mhm.
Um, the way that we, as a relatively small team, earlier as a relatively young office, maybe not so young anymore, but uh, but still relatively small. The way that we're able to have kind of a global presence, the way that we're able to do projects that are very, very much larger than this one now, with much more complexity, is to create collaborative working relationships with the right kinds of people. So it's a way of us being able to concentrate on what we're really good at,
Hmm.
and also learn from these different kinds of building experiences. It's like I don't know the next time that we will make a project on a ship. Then the next one will go much faster, much more smoother. So if there are any listeners out there who have nautical projects, give us a call sometime. Like we know what we're doing. Now we've learned a lot, but also that you know that learning is transportable to many other kinds of environments. We're sort of part of because of the way that this firm came up. As a firm in New York City. New York is a challenging place to work, even on small and relatively simple projects. It's political, it's technical, it's expensive, it's materials, it's logistics, it's all of those things. And so as a result, I think we are a firm that is extremely comfortable with sort of a difficult proposition. And as you say, the thing that we're after, of course, is to produce an environment that is refined, that is elegant,
Hmm.
that is easy, that is comfortable, that doesn't really show the sweat of the blood, the tears that
The
went into
process.
it. Yeah, like nobody needs to know about that. Like
Mhm.
nobody wants to know about that. They want to know that they are working with an architect who has the capabilities to manage a difficult situation and to deliver. And so that's something that we've just had to learn how to do for ourselves. And that's not something that we just own. It's like we work with people who help us, and who can help us to deliver in the right way. So that's I think the bigger takeaway from the code question. It's tricky, but it's also a lot of fun.
So for potential collaborators and potential clients who want you to redesign their yachts, what's the best way for people to learn more about you and get in touch with you and your practice?
I mean, we Instagram at MKC Architecture, and our website is mkca.com, and we are open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year on those two platforms. Otherwise, we are in New York during regular business hours, and you're welcome to give us a call.
Amazing. So one additional question early on in the interview, I mentioned design advocates. So tell our listeners a little bit about that, how it came to be, and what you're doing with that.
Absolutely. So Design Advocates, it was born of the pandemic. It was an organization that we co-founded with a small group of four other offices in March of 2020, right as the pandemic shutdown kind of took hold in New York City. It began as a information and resourcing sharing platform conversation among small firms, small design firms, and very quickly transitioned into a design aid based organization in sort of the depths of the pandemic. So beginning in April or June of 2020, we decided to try to use our fallow staff, our kind of our access time to do pro bono projects for organizations and communities of need, kind of working in primarily concentrated in New York City, but really increasingly kind of all over the nation. So it was really that was a really extraordinary experience. About 250 firms and volunteers participated in Design Advocates in the first couple of years. We did about 100 projects and engagements in that time. all as small collaborative teams between offices, which I think was really an extraordinary opportunity. We have a lot of community in among architects and designers, but not that many opportunities to actually collaborate with one another. So just the ability to kind of roll up your sleeves with your friends, with your
Mhm.
peers, and do something meaningful to help people directly or to help people who were going to help a lot of other people, was really extraordinary. In the last couple of years, we've transitioned DA to more of a uh, kind of a leaner organization that's still operating with that value system. We are still very much concentrated on working on the intersection of sort of equality and the built environment,
Mhm.
and but through sort of more substantial, longer term projects, often with municipalities or with larger organizations, and kind of really working at that intersection between community engagement and visioning and design, which is a space that we felt was maybe a little under resourced. So really just using our experience working directly with communities, um, to develop design thinking that serves sort of the needs of those communities. So we're working on a variety of different kinds of projects, one of which is a series of public open spaces in suburban Washington, D.C.,
Mhm.
with the local government there in Montgomery County. We're working on a couple of other like longer term simmering projects. We're about actually this weekend to install a enclosure for a community refrigerator at a public housing development on the Upper East Side.
Yeah.
That's a partnership with a nonprofit called Grassroots Grocery. So we're still kind of many of these like longer term projects that were construction intensive, um, are now coming to fruition over a long period of time. And I think we're excited about keeping this as an organization that moves into the future. So that is also something that we're actively taking inquiries from interested parties, who have maybe an unusual project that might fall outside of what conventional architectural practices can help them with.
That's amazing. So, listeners, please consider donating to Design Advocates, or actually, can people donate to it?
People can donate, but we issue very specific calls around individual projects, and so usually we don't take donations to, or we have not historically taken donations as an organization. We've usually
Sure.
just tried to funnel any giving directly into projects and the
Amazing.
nonprofits that kind of that they're for.
That's perfect. So, donate in that particular way to Design Advocates if it interests you, and then the link to the organization will be in the show notes, along with the images and links to things that we referenced in the interview. So,
And
appreciate your
we Instagram at Design Advocates, and our website is designadvocates.org.
excellent. So, appreciate your time today, Michael. So, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much.
I'm Atif Kader, and thanks for joining me on American Building. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite listening app and leave a rating and review. America's housing crisis is one of our greatest challenges, but what are the real solutions? Hear from the developers and other industry experts driving meaningful change. Get our exclusive guide, Housing in America: 8 Ways We Can Solve Our Way Out of a Crisis, at AmericanBuildingPodcast.com.